Hi, Jim Dowdles. This is part 3 of our rendering project, our first rendering project. In part 3, I'm going to talk about getting started with your rendering, what materials we're going to use. We're going to keep it very simple. The materials that we need are Canson paper. We've already got our drawing transferred to the Canson paper. We've got tape around the edges. We're ready to start. We'll talk about materials. Black and white Prismacolor pencils. You can use other types of color pencils. I suggested a couple of different kinds that are worthwhile in the materials list if you can't get the Prismacolor, but I really like the Prismacolor. So you can get these on Amazon. You should be able to buy extra. I've used probably around 2 or 3 already because I actually did a background, and that takes almost a whole black pencil sometimes. So bottom line is you're probably going to need more than one. A set of colored pencils, which I suggested that you buy for a project that we're going to do later, has a black and a white pencil in it, but I can honestly say that you're going to be better off if you get a couple of black Prismacolor pencils. Okay? First thing we're going to do to get started is I'm going to do a demonstration of a value scale. And this will be a value scale of what we're using, the black and the white colored pencil on the gray Canson paper. You should have a piece of gray Canson paper left over that you trimmed off of the entire sheet before we started on it. It can be about 3 or 4 inches wide like this. It doesn't need to be this long, obviously. You know, I've got a little extra room on it. I taped off my border so that you can be nice and clean and crisp. That's up to you. You don't need to do that if you don't want to. So the first thing that I'm going to do is demonstrate how to do that value scale. So getting started with my value scale, I've taped off an area here. It looks like it's a little over 1 inch high and maybe 8 inches long. That's a decent size for a value scale. You might have done black and white value scales before. You might have done black value scales with a graphite pencil on white paper. So in this project we're using a neutral gray. It's a mid-value paper. That's the middle values of our subject matter too. We're going to go dark with black, we're going to go light with white. What I suggest is don't start at the edge and make it super dark right away. I'm suggesting that you start in the center with black and with white, but starting off very lightly, softly, and leave some area in between open, which will be our mid-value. So I'm building it up very lightly. Use the type of strokes that you're going to use. If you're going to do cross-hatching, go ahead and do it here. You can do more than one value scale too. You can do several and practice your techniques. A lot of what I'm going to do is circular strokes on my rendering, so you could start off with that for sure. Okay, I'm not done yet, but I'm going to cut to the chase so you don't get bored and you get the idea how it works. I'm going to lay this one down so you can see as I go. So I started in the center more or less. I moved it over a little bit from center and started with black. I'm going to do the same thing with white over here. So I'm going to start off just super softly. I won't say super lightly because you might get the idea that I'm talking about bright light. I'm not. I'm talking about light texture or light pressure. And you're doing the same thing. You're building it up as you go out to the edges, in this case the right side. So there should be a very faint transition right in this area between blacks and whites. You want to keep the 2 value color pencils, black and white. You want to keep them distinct from each other. You want to keep them separate. You can do it with circular strokes. You can do it with cross-hatching. I'm not at the most comfortable angle for going across my body here, and you'll find that in your drawing, in your rendering, you'll probably find the most comfortable directions, pencil strokes to go with. And a lot of it has to do with, could be, these small circular strokes. So the idea is that you're going to build up as you go. The mantra that you've always got to say is that I can always go darker with adding more black. I can always go lighter with adding more white, but it's hard, it's almost impossible to go backwards, to make it too dark and then to go backwards and make it lighter. So it's safe. It's a safe way to build up your values slowly. Okay? Now take your time, because hopefully you're going to take your time on your rendering. Okay? So when your value scale is finished, it should look something like this. You could do either way. You could do white this way and black that way. It doesn't really matter. Work from the center out. Okay? It's a colored pencil value scale. So I got started a little bit on the rendering here. I've been going over the shadow areas with my black Prismacolor pencil, and I'm not going to go very dark, and you're going to have to be patient with me because it's going to take quite a while. I'm going to, of course, have to fast forward to more advanced steps at some point soon. But wanted to talk about getting started. I've got my value scale here on the side. You know, I can always look at my reference, gauge that. This first step, which takes probably at least 2 or 3 hours, I'm just going to work with a black colored pencil. I'm going to start building up my lightest values. I'll work in the darkest areas because that's probably the safest place to start. I'm using small circular strokes. When you first start rendering, you're going to have to remember that this whole process is a rendering from the start. It's not like charcoal where you can put a whole tone down and start pulling lights out. So as you put the darks in, they're always going to be there. You can just keep making them stronger and darker. It's a better way than making things too dark and then having to go back in and erasing. So bear with me. Good idea at this point is to do some shadow mapping. So I'm looking at my reference and I'm creating a map of where my shadows are going to be, my cast shadows. My core shadows are a little bit more subtle. Each one of these forms that's rounded or cylindrical has a core shadow. You want to make sure that you refer back to my PowerPoint presentation that has all the information, the review that you need on value, creating value, value terminology, cast shadow, core shadow, lights, highlights, reflected light. So the whole idea at the beginning is to block in lightly, but at the same time, you know, we spend a lot of time getting good contours with this drawing. So being aware of your contours at all times. There's a really nice core shadow right along the top of the abdominal muscle here. You can block that in. Large areas, you know, you can probably feel safe to do a glaze or a wash of colored pencil everywhere, but I notice that at the bottom of this abdominal muscle, for instance, there's some really nice reflected light in here. So I'm going to stay away from that. I'm going back to my circular strokes. They seem to work pretty well, building up my values. So I'm going to be doing this for about 2 hours. I'm going to pause and restart the video about 2 hours in, and you'll see where I'm at. I'm going to just focus on the torso right here at first, and we're going to go to that. So we've moved ahead now to maybe about 2 more hours from what I just ended with. Spent about 2 more hours on it, building up the values, leaving it fairly light, not overcommitting myself to the darkest values yet. Still working on this one torso area. Okay, so I'm strengthening darker edges, checking my reference all the time. It's right in front of me here. Looking for any areas where I can strengthen, darken. I'm still using small circular strokes. If you have large areas and you want to just wash or drop in a light wash over everything to strengthen it, darken it, you can do that with cross hatching. But remember, this is a white statue in the first place, so I don't want to go too dark, too black. But I do want my darks to work. My reference has a dark background on this side. It's a dark background all over, but I want to make sure in my focal area that's right in here that I'm going to do a fairly dark background. So I want to watch my values over here along this edge where there's some reflected light along the edge of the rib cage over here. So I don't want to go too dark with it. I can always go darker later. Just keep telling yourself that. It's really difficult to go lighter. Colored pencil isn't meant to be erased, especially when it's on Canson paper. So remember that. Build up slowly and you won't have to resort to erasing. At the very end of the project, there might be some areas that you want to soften a little bit, strengthen with white, but soften with black. So I'll talk about using the kneaded eraser, but not really erasing back and forth with it, more or less just kind of pouncing it and just softly lighting it. So that's where I'm at right now. I'm building up this area. I'm strengthening it. I'm still using circular strokes. Keeping my eye on my reference and my value scale. My value scale is always here. You can use it to see here, but I also use it on my reference. Okay? So I've zoomed out a bit so you can see most of the statue, the Belvedere torso, and I've also zoomed ahead about 4 hours, maybe closer to 5, and gotten pretty much where I want to get for this week, and where I want you guys to be for this week is to work with black. Don't worry about the background. We'll talk about the background next week. You'll have next week to work on adding the white and doing the background. If you want to get started on the background, it's got to be cross-hatched and hatched. It's got to be carefully rendered right up against the form. But we'll talk about that more next week. If you get ahead and you want to work ahead, try laying in a light wash of background. What I'm really focusing on now is detail. I've got some really nice detail on the texture of his chest, the cutaway view of the chest. So I'm going to work that up with small circular strokes with my black pencil. I've changed over to a Caran d'Arche, a really, really nice colored pencil. If you can find them individually, you should buy 2 or 3 black ones. They're just as good as Prismacolor, maybe a little bit better. Really nice French colored pencil. So that's what I'm going to do to wrap this up, and that will take us up to the end of this week. And then for the assignment next week, I'll send you out a demo to wrap up, as I said before, adding the white. Don't put any white on yet. And adding a background. Okay? And just one final tip. And literally it's a tip. When you want to darken your values, we've been using almost a underhand, sort of a soft stroke. If you gravitate towards more of a point now, and that means your point's got to be really sharp, like this, you're going to be able to add a lot stronger depth of color value. Okay? All right.